Welcome to Bluewater Spring State Fish Hatchery. My name is Matt Wipf. I am the hatchery manager here at the Fish Hatchery. And I've been the manager here since 2019. The hatchery itself was built in 1945, and then there was a full remodel in 2000 to kind of expand. We got a great water source. We've got Bluewater Springs, which is 3,000 gallons a minute, and Tillet Springs, which is 600 gallons a minute. So we use what's called partial reuse aquaculture. So we reuse that water several times before it actually goes out into our effluent. We raise right around 1 million rainbow trout for sportmen fishing across the state of Montana. So 1 million rainbows, and then we also raise 1 million grayling focused on restoration and recovery of that species. There are 12 state hatcheries, and we'll talk about those here in just a little bit. All right, so where in the world is Bluewater Spring State Fish Hatchery? We're actually fairly remote for a Montana hatchery. We're kind of south central, located south of Billings, about 40, if you're familiar with Montana, about 45 miles south of west of Billings. And once you get to Bridger, you take a gravel road about 10 miles east of Bridger, and you kind of get to the point where you're like, am I lost? And then you end up in this beautiful valley. We're right in between two mountain ranges, the Beartooths and the Pryor Mountains. And so we get this rain shadow desert effect, where some of you in Eastern Washington are kind of familiar with that, where we're kind of arid and dry, a lot of sagebrush, but then there's these beautiful lush mountains on either side of us. So but to drop down in this valley, it's just lush, full of water. It's a pretty cool place to be. Like I said, there are 12 state fish hatcheries that are run by the state of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. There's two federal hatcheries, and then there's a handful of private facilities. All right, so I kind of want to walk you through, give you the full tour of what Bluewater looks like. At the top of your screen, you can call that north, and it is north. And so we'll work like around a compass here. So if we go directly to the east, you see Tillet Springs and Bluewater Springs. Like I said before, we're getting 3,000 gallons a minute from Bluewater and 600 from Tillet. These are all coming from the Madison Aquifer, about 58 degrees. And the only really crazy thing about this water is that it's fairly turbid on occasion. It gets kind of grumpy every now and again, and turbidity gets fairly high. And the other thing is that we're coming up through a lot of sandstone, so we have our water hardness is about 1,200 parts per million calcium magnesium, which is pretty hard stuff. And we're going to talk about why that's so important a little bit later here. As we follow the flow of the spring, we kind of go down to the southern end of the image here. You're looking at the main hatchery building and just kind of working west. We've got an upper set of raceways, so the water flows through the hatchery into the raceways and then into the lower set of raceways. And then you can see sort of on that west central part is the effluent. That's where all the water from either the hatchery flow through stuff from the raceways is going into Bluewater Creek, or coming from our settling ponds there, you can see kind of in that northwest corner. The two settling ponds, or you call them four because that's what they look like, furthest north are for the upper raceways and the tank room, and the lowest settling pond is actually just for that lower set of raceways. Those upper two settling ponds are actually all that's left of the original 1945 hatchery build. And those are going to come into play later because we had some issues with those, and we'll talk about that as we kind of go on here. Well, I'll give you a little bit of history on the New Zealand mud snails. They were detected in Bluewater Creek in the early 2000s. And as a design flaw, I think from the 2000 build, the effluents, you'll see a picture of that coming up, the effluents were sort of buried under riprap. So it gave those snails access to the hatchery. They came up this big, beautiful waterfall, which isn't complete, like, waterfall where there's any separation, they can easily crawl up that thing and then get into the plumbing for the hatchery. And that's exactly what happened just over time. So, all right. So the New Zealand mud snails, they're pretty small. They're definitely an aquatic invasive species in the United States. Montana is, in like other states, working very hard to minimize the impact of aquatic invasives. Uh, Here you can see sort of the uh, distribution of New Zealand mud snails across the United States. Not a lot in Montana, but you can definitely see we do have some big impacts here, big impacted areas, especially in that southwestern section of Montana. These things are really small, hard to crush. They've got that dextral spiraling, unlike our native physid snails, um, where it's a left-handed spiraling. The physid snails are really, I'm going to say soft because you can put them in your fingers and crunch, and they'll crush pretty quick and easy. The New Zealand mud snails are very, very hard to crush. And then they also have this operculum, and they can survive a lot of digestive tracts. And so, any sort of birds or animals coming up from Bluewater Creek that end up near the raceways, they can definitely defecate and leave those snails inside the raceways. So those are things we're always combating. These snails, they're very small, uh, 4 to 6 millimeters. The picture of the one on the left here is just on the crosshair of little 5 millimeter square sections. And so they're just not very big, but you can definitely find them in abundance, or you could when we've detected them in 2020. All right, so detection and our techniques. The original detection was just in 2020. The state of Montana thought we should get with our aquatic invasive species program and have them come onto the hatcheries. This has never happened before. They've always come to our water sources around us, but never have they ever come onto the hatcheries. And so this was a great collaboration where we could work together. They could help us identify issues, things that we didn't know that we should be looking for. And lo and behold, they found here at Bluewater the New Zealand mud snails in our settling ponds and in our lower set of raceways. Thankfully, the lower set of raceways, there's a gap from our aeration towers, so the snails couldn't quite jump up there, so we didn't get a spread from on the upper part of our raceways or into our upper plumbing, but we did do some mitigation work up there just to make sure. We also used eDNA, not really as a management tool, but more of just like hey, are they there? Are they not there? Um, it it's a tool that's great to have and in your toolbox just to see what you got going on in your system. We did a lot of physical checking. It was a lot of hands and knees, crawling around, looking in cracks, crawling in a lot of fish waste. It was a pretty gross endeavor at certain times. All right, so when I talk about a project this big, especially when I'm talking to my team and my staff, it was a large project. We broke it into several phases, and I tried to explain to them like, you can look at this big elephant and like all these things that we need to do to get past all this, but if we just eat it one bite at a time, eventually it's all going to get gone. We're going to be past this, and you're going to realize like, oh man, it wasn't so bad. Just eat that elephant one bit at a time and don't look at the whole thing. Otherwise, it gets pretty daunting. So as we walk through the phases, the first phase, and this was a meeting with our hatchery bureau chief, our fish chief, with the state of Montana, all the regional fish managers. And we came up with a plan to mitigate for the detection of these snails at the facility. And this wasn't the only detection that they had found. There was actually a private hatchery that was in Montana that was going through a very similar situation. And so they pretty much followed what we're doing right here. So the first phase was to destroy all the fish, remove any habitat, destroy the mud snails through disinfection. We're going to walk through all of this. And then just like everybody had said on Tuesday, and sort of our mantra for AIS in Montana is clean, drain, dry. And so that's what we're doing. We're cleaning, we're draining, and then we're gonna dry. We're gonna disinfect, and then we're gonna dry. And then we want to come back and make sure that the inspection is successful. We want to inspect the hatchery. We want to look at every nook and cranny and crack and crevice and make sure that we got all those snails, albeit they're pretty tiny and hard to look for everywhere. So the best way to start out with just a biosecurity plan, and this is just a big image on my wall in my office that I framed because it was just so important, is to know how the water flows through the hatchery, where your shutoff points are, where the disconnect points are, where you can divert water from, and all that. It's such an important part. And as we were going through the whole disinfection process and kind of taking care of this whole thing, this was just full of sticky notes of places that we had cleaned, not cleaned, needed addressed, all that sort of stuff. It was a great place for my staff to come back and reference what's next and where do we need to go. So just a great thing to have for a biosecurity plan, and just having that plastered on the wall. So the first phase, like I talked about, was destroying the fish. And you could use several methods here. Tricane methanyl sulfate. You could use electrolysis. We chose carbon dioxide. It was easy to hook those. I say easy, and I say that really with a sad tone in my voice, because we destroyed a lot of fish. But it was relatively easy to change over from oxygen to CO2 on our distribution trucks. And so what we ended up doing is just crowding fish up, pumping them onto our semis, and we made a deal with our neighbor where we could dump all the mortalities into one of their coulees. So at this point, we had probably planted out the majority of our catchable fish. Like I said earlier, we stock about 1 million rainbows across the state of Montana. On an average year, that's about 70,000 pounds of fish. But when we had detected the snails, we had been through a major part of our stocking season. And so we were sort of at the tail end of it. And so for destroying fish, really, we only had to destroy about 20,000 pounds of fish. It seems like a lot, but we did get about 50,000 pounds of fish out. So that was all right. But it ended up being about 300,000 fish that we destroyed. Later, we put up some cameras on this coulee, and we saw some black bears. We had a wolf come from Yellowstone, actually had a caller. One of the biologists from Yellowstone came out, and they had detected that he was way out here. So that was kind of a neat thing to see. A lot of birds coming and getting a lot of food. All right. After we had destroyed all the fish, it was time to drain all the water, clean everything out, and look and see really where these snails were. And Bluewater is made up of 24 raceways, 2 intake raceways. Both of those are one each on the upper unit of raceways and the lower unit. Those head canals, they have been full of water since 2000. So the calcium magnesium buildup on the side of these intake walls was fairly significant, and the snails it was a great habitat for them to be in. This first image is of the lower raceway head canal there, and you can see just the bottom of the aeration towers, and then you can see the side walls. The next picture is a picture of the side wall, and you can see we're pointing at some mud snails that had just made themselves a little nest area in that intake. And then part of the mitigation work, it wasn't fun. It was relatively boring. Was just taking a multi-tool and scraping all of that hard water buildup off the side of that intake wall. And so that wasn't fun, but it was a lot of work. Again, it was just like, elephant eating little bite at a time. While we had things down, like I said, Bluewater and Tillet both are fairly turbid, and this is our main first aeration pass. And as we had shut water off and got in there, it had been so silted in over 20 years of just nonstop running that we had had this opportunity to do some real cleaning and some real disinfection in areas that had just never been touched since the beginning of the the remodel. And so, I mean, we lifted out 5-gallon bucket after 5-gallon bucket of mud. There was no snails up. There weren't any snails up in this area of the hatchery, but it was a great time to get in there and clean things out. And that center picture, I don't know if you can see, kind of the top right corner, it's a little green, little bryophytes growing there. That's the intake. It was for the hatchery. It was really covered up with a ton of mud. So, and the next picture is just looking from the bottom up, kind of craziness right there. All right, once we got all the mud clean and everything done, it was time to pressure wash the raceways after having all the fish taken out of them and destroyed. We pressure washed all the raceways, all the tanks, all the intake raceways, the outflow canals, the settling ponds. We had staff coming from all over Montana. The middle guy here is a volunteer that has followed me from Great Falls. He's a great guy, Daryl Beach. And then the image on the right there is Jay Pravacek, our hatchery bureau chief, who just loves to get in and get dirty and help work. He's actually cleaning out one of the lower settling ponds. Keep that lower settling pond in your head because we're going to come back to that later. But a lot of help went into just this part of pressure washing raceways and getting the hatchery ready. One of the other things that hadn't been done since 2000 was none of the settling ponds had been actually cleaned out. So once we drained the water out, there was 20 years of sediment and fish waste inside each one of these settling ponds. This was a huge undertaking, but really we rented a mini excavator. We scooped up all the waste. We loaded on the trucks. We made a great deal with a neighbor for some fertilizer, dumped it on his hay fields, and we were good to go. The only problem was the lowest settling pond. We could only put the excavator bucket at the head end of the settling pond, and there was 100 feet, about 20 inches deep, 30 inches deep of fish waste. And so we had to 5-gallon bucket every little bit of that thing out. And this is again when we took the eat the elephant one bite at a time. It was a lot of work. We sweated our butts off, but we did eventually get it cleaned out. Matter of fact, it was so clean and nice that we were able to get our disinfection stuff done. But I was jumping ahead of myself here. Everything was nice and clean. And so my daughter, who was graduating from high school that year, was like, "Oh man, Dad, this is awesome. I want to get my senior picture taken down here." So she got a couple of them taken down there, and we were like, "Oh man, this is the cleanest it's ever going to be. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity. So you should totally do it." And she did. I thought that would be a fun image to add. All right. Well, once senior pictures were done and stuff was clean, we actually had to shut all the water off to the hatchery. And then it was time to get serious with a lot of disinfection. And then this is really when we consulted our map, our biosecurity map of the hatchery, and followed through with a ton of disinfection. Again, here's Jay Pravacek, our hatchery bureau chief, shutting off all the water. Not a smile on his face. This was a tough time. If you've ever worked in a hatchery, if you've ever walked in your tank room or the hatchery building and you don't hear water running, that's like your first sign of like, holy cow, something's wrong. So it's a little eerie to walk in the hatchery and be like, there's no water running at all. So anyway, all right. So the first thing we did was, again, we went to that map of all the plumbing, and we got cotters to come out, and we hot water jetted. This is something they typically do to drain fields. You know, they'll shoot this thing up and it'll clean out any of the clogged areas. We wanted to shoot this thing up, heat the water up inside their trailer there. They've got a diesel motor that heats water up to over 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it was piping hot water. Those snails, they don't like that. So they would shoot this thing up, and that ball it had these holes that shot backwards. So when the water pressure built in there, it would shoot that thing up the pipes, and the guy controlling it would just kind of turn the hose, and that would rotate the ball in there, and it would go all over throughout the hatchery. Initially, the pipes were fairly big for something like this, and the ball had turned around and hit one of the guys in the head. So we had to adapt it and put some rebar tape to it, so there wasn't this flopping ball in there, and so it'd shoot up, and we could get everything disinfected without sending somebody to the emergency room to get stitches. Once that was done, it was time to tear apart the aeration towers. If you remembered the last few pictures and the words that I've talked about as far as the water hardness and the turbidity, the sediment that we get running through the hatchery every now and again with our temperamental springs, this was where we really had to put our backs into it because these towers had not really been worked on for 20 years. And what had happened is they had got built in, they should look like this image on the left, where you have these coke rings, water splashes, dissolved oxygen, or oxygen from the atmosphere goes into the water. Any nitrogen that's in there goes out to an equilibrium. And then, it's good for the fish. Well, what had been happening is that a buildup of the calcium, magnesium, and then all that sediment coming out as precipitate formed rock in these towers. And so we had to get in there and clean those out. This was like, we used jackhammers, we used sledgehammers. It was a huge undertaking because we have 7 aeration towers that needed cleaned out. And we went to this new aluminum baffle aeration method, which is actually a little bit better at getting oxygen into the water based on our elevation. So that's actually pretty nice. We're not seeing any buildup of calcium, magnesium on there, and we're not seeing any sediment sticking to that. So that's been a great addition.
Just about 3 minutes left, Matt.
Once all those were, oh, thank you. Once all those were done, oh man, okay, I'll speed up. We went through the hot water decontamination of every surface of the hatchery. So again, we heated up our water and we hot water surface touched everything at the hatchery. And it was a couple days. And we worked into the night. Actually, it took 3 days. And when we got finally into the settling pond, everybody's like, we're just going to work into the night until we can finish this. And it was a great team of folks. The whole AIS team for Montana was out helping us. It was a big team effort. When we talk about where those snails actually came from, they came up Bluewater Creek. The image on the left here is what the effluent looked like from 2000 until 2020. And so you can't even see the pipe. So my job, I took the excavator with the thumb on it, grabbed all the riprap rock out of there and exposed those pipes. Then poured a little concrete down there to stop any erosion because we didn't have the riprap there anymore. And then added some elbows to create a drop. We extended that even further and we copperized. I think I just made that word up, but we added copper to all this plumbing and extended our effluent from this to that to this. Now, the reason for the copper, the snails, they don't like the copper. When I think about this copper, it reminds me of another treatment method that folks have used, this EarthTech QZ, and they titrate that through the hatchery, which is a copper-based control, and people killed a lot of fish with those. They weren't real successful. This seemed to be the best method, is to create that separation from our effluents to the waterfall there, and then add that copper in to reduce any snails. Snails, they could crawl on it. The literature says to keep copper at 3 feet or greater, and you won't really have any issues with snails. My only question is, how long will those copper ions last? I don't know that answer. So we talked about, that was, sorry, I'm gonna go back. That was the end of 2020. We were super happy. Everything was great. In 2022, we had another AIS inspection, and those old settling ponds that were the original raceways from the 1945 build, one of those had a crack in it, and at least a snail, because they can survive they can reproduce asexually, survived the original decon, and we found more snails in there in 2022. So the idea was to, hey, let's destroy and take out all of those settling ponds. Let's build all brand new. And so that's what we did. And so we built these all brand new settling ponds. Now you can see some of these blue pipes sticking out. Those are knife gates to allow for complete shutoffs between settling ponds, so we can have that clean drain dry times between uses. And then like the middle picture, we don't have to get in there and shovel waste into excavator buckets. And then part of the management plan now is to use this dredge. We dredge the settling ponds monthly as well. Oh, sweet. I did make it to the end. All right. So moving forward, we really had to revise sort of our biosecurity plan based on these New Zealand mud snails. And so we did a full revision, not just for Bluewater, but for every state fish hatchery in Montana. As much as we can, we try to do dry times. Again, it just goes back to that clean, drain, dry. We do a fall hot water treatment on all the surfaces during dry time for the raceways when the raceways have dry times. We stick to our annual new AIS inspections, which are great. We do the monthly settling dredge cleanouts. And then it's all about maintaining awareness. The whole human dimension part of this is a whole nother factor when you talk about biosecurity and how important it is. And, you know, for your staff to be there and be present for these things, they get the importance of it. But as staff changes, then you got to re-emphasize like, hey, this is so important and this is why it's important. And sometimes it's tough to get that buy-in, but if you can have those conversations and make that an important note right away and first off, they seem to get on board. And then here's my contact information, or just my email anyway. Feel free to contact me with any questions or maybe advice. I'm happy to take that as well.